Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to Opera and Conversation. Today, we're absolutely delighted to be joined by Dame Jane Glover. She's a British-born conductor and musicologist, and what's really exciting is that she was a student at Oxford as well, and she actually went on to conduct the first performance in modern times of Cavalli's Rosinda for Oxford University Opera Club in her time. Dame Jane is also the Felix Mendelssohn Visiting Professor of Opera at the Royal Academy of Music. We're so happy to have us here today to talk about her music, her experience in what I'm sure is definitely going to be an inspirational 1 hour ahead. So I'll turn it over to Zelina without any further delay. Please enjoy.
Great. Thank you so much, Priya, and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for today's episode of Opera in Conversation. Just a quick notice, I'd like to say that we will be announcing an upcoming project that we're currently working on at the end of the talk, so please do stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, I'm really honoured to be joined by Dame Jane Glover. Thank you so much for joining us, Jane.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So I want to just begin our talk by asking the big question really, which is how did you become a conductor, and also how did you get started in opera?
Well, it's all down to this university that we're all so proud of, really. I mean, when I came up to Oxford, I thought I was probably going to be an oboist, when I'd finished my undergraduate. I mean, how many of us really know what we're going to do when we arrive as undergraduates? And I was a particularly green and knowledgeless undergraduate. I mean, I'm still amazed that I got into Oxford, actually, because I really didn't know anything, but certainly didn't know what I was going to do. I played the oboe a lot and I sang a lot, but I had done a little bit of conducting at school, and then I started conducting in my first year at St. Hugh's, and then it just sort of felt all right. And you know how it is at Oxford, everybody plays and sings for everybody else. And people came after a while, people came and played and sang for me, and it sort of felt right. And so I started doing bigger things. And in fact, in the term before my finals, I conducted Figaro at the Playhouse, which was probably a bit stupid in terms of my degree. But I have to say that doing that for the University Opera Club in my final year as an undergraduate, I think probably was the experience that taught me more than anything else that I'd learned in those 3 years, frankly, about what I do now. That's not in any way to denigrate the experience of being an undergraduate at Oxford, though in my day it was so academic, which I didn't mind, except I wasn't very good at it, but I got better at it. And at the end of my undergraduate years, I had sort of become fascinated with 17th century Italian opera, and went on to do my DPhil on that, as you probably know. But the objective of doing that was not just to spend 4 years divided between Oxford and Venice, which isn't a bad way of spending 4 years, really, but it was to look at those Cavalli scores, which at that time hadn't really been looked at for 300 and something years, and make performing editions of them and put them back where they belonged in the theatre. And as Priya said, I did do the first, we in Oxford did the first performance in modern times of Cavalli's Rosinda. And one thing led to another. I did lots of other stuff while I was still doing my DPhil. And then at the end of doing my DPhil, I had to make this big decision of whether I followed my supervisor's plan, which was that I would have an academic career doing this and this and this, or whether I was going to try and be a real musician. And not that there's anything unreal about what goes on there, but it just, I felt a need to do it. And so I gave myself 2 years to see if it would work. And some of it did work for 2 years and some of it didn't. And of course, it's ghastly setting out. One has no work at all, really, but it's sort of, I'm still here, as the lady says in Follies.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. And I think it's just incredible that you were able to do those productions whilst being an undergrad, not to say even the term before finals. That's definitely something that we have tried to cultivate through commissioning operas and performing operas. And I think that opportunity to perform and just do opera as a student is really invaluable, and something that we've just definitely cultivated.
Absolutely. And indeed, I was thinking about this today in advance of talking to you. I don't know if this name means anything to you now, but does the name Stephen Oliver mean anything to Oxford University opera people? He was a contemporary of mine. He sadly died of AIDS in the 90s. He's probably one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. Certainly was a sort of huge beacon, and he was no exact contemporary of mine. And he was a bit sort of Mozartian. By the time he arrived at Oxford, at age 18, he'd already written sort of 6 operas, and one of them had been performed by the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic, and blah 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 blah. And it was through knowing Stephen, really, I owe so much to him, that I became so completely indebted to opera and involved in opera. And the term after we graduated, the University Opera Club put on his Duchess of Malfi, which was an absolutely brilliant piece. It's been done quite a bit since around the place. And then he had a fabulous career. And the year before he died, his Tom Jones was done at ENO. But meanwhile, Malfi had been done all over the world, and that sort of thing. Sadly, his name has sunk a bit, and clearly you've not heard of him. But Graham Vick, whom you had last week, I gather, in this enviable seat, did also a lot of Stephen's stuff when we were all kids together, So yeah, very important to do contemporary opera, and I'm thrilled you're doing it. Thrilled, because one has to keep the pot.
Well, thank you. I'm very glad that you've given us an endorsement. It's really, really kind. I mean, it's interesting that, obviously you kind of weren't necessarily thinking about becoming a conductor from day one. That wasn't like a lightning moment, but you obviously clearly had an attraction to opera. So I wanted to ask, what is it about opera specifically that you loved so much back then and continue to love to this day?
Well, I've always been passionate about the theatre. I mean, I just love everything about it. And the fact that opera combines everything, good storytelling, a good libretto, and a theatrical presentation, and the ability to lose oneself in these wonderful old stories which actually tell us so much about ourselves. I mean, things like the Mozart operas, of course, which even if they look on the surface to be sort of superficial, like everybody says Così is so superficial, I think it's one of the most profound operas I know, which tells us so much about human nature. And there's, it's like Shakespeare, you just, every time you do a Mozart opera, and of course I do them all, do them all the time, you just feel you're peeling off another layer of the onion, and getting a little bit closer to the heart of it and discovering what it's all about. It's like Shakespeare. It just goes on challenging you and revealing stuff to you. And that's the sort of ecstasy and the challenge of it. It all comes together. Of course, it's not all wonderful, and there are areas of opera I don't do, but there are certain areas I do more than others. Since we are talking about contemporary opera, I have to tell you that one of the most thrilling, I mean, I'm probably known for 18th century music now, rather than even 17th century music, which is where I started. I'm incredibly happy in the 18th century. But one of the most thrilling experiences I've had, and it was fairly recent, was when I was at Director of Opera at the Royal Academy of Music, and we did the Peter Maxwell Davies Commilitonen. We premiered that, and in 2011. And it was about 2 years before he died. He was already quite ill. But to work on that with him and with David Pountney, who wrote the libretto, and to have them both in the room was like having Mozart and Da Ponte in the room, and they would just sort of say, well, I think we need to put this in here and just stretch that a bit. And it was so thrilling, very challenging. I don't know if you know it. Have you come across it? It's actually something you might look at, because it's great for young people. It's 3 stories about young students, basically, intertwined, and then the stories come together. One is Chinese, one is German, and one is American. Look it up, Kommilitonen, with an exclamation mark, which David Partney put in. I didn't like the exclamation mark. I thought it made it look like Oklahoma, but there we are. It's a fabulous piece, and that was, as I say, one of the most thrilling things I've done.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'll definitely look it up and consider programming it for the future.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's interesting that you reference all these different styles. How do you think your conducting style changes depending on the work that you're doing?
That's interesting. I think one's conducting style changes as one gets more experience anyway, whatever one is doing. I think probably, I mean, it's hard to admit this these days, but I have to say I'm one of that generation of conductors who's never had a conducting lesson. Now, in my day, there weren't, these great conducting programs at the conservatories, and that there just weren't that. So, people like of my generation, we just sort of clambered our way into the profession somehow, and learned on the job. But having said that, although I'm in awe of the conducting courses at places like the Academy, which are run by the great Charles Nicholas, and elsewhere all around the world, I think the thing about conducting is there are only really 2 ways to learn it. One is to observe really great conductors, and the other is to do it. And my advice always to young conductors, is just neglect no opportunity to use a gardening metaphor, to get your hands dirty. Get in there, and even if it's a church choir or a madrigal group or a brass band or a string orchestra or an adult orchestra on an evening course or anything, just get in there and just do it, and acquire some repertoire. I mean, I don't know if it's still going. There used to be something in Oxford called the Holywell Orchestra. Does that mean it was basically an adult evening class? And
I'm not sure if we have it. There's definitely the Holywell Music Room and the sort of
course, yeah.
No,
yeah, of course. But it was actually nothing to do with the Holywell Music Room. I think we rehearsed in Magdalen College School or something like that. But it's every Tuesday evening I would go down there, and there would be all these sort of, I thought then they were terribly elderly. They're no doubt years younger than I am now, but people sitting there who came at the end of work, and some undergraduates too. And sometimes you had 50 people in the room, and sometimes you had 24 people in the room, but you had sort of some repertoire. And my goodness, I had a great time learning a lot of repertoire that way. And but I'm not answering your question, so I'll go back to your question, which is, how has it changed? When I do 17th century stuff now, I direct from the harpsichord, and so that's a very different technique to I absolutely adore it. It's the nearest I get to chamber music. It's the nearest I get to playing Brahms piano quintets, which I couldn't possibly do, sadly, because that's what it is. Obviously, if you're doing something enormous like the War Requiem, where you've got just so many people in front of you, then your gestures have to be much bigger. And yet, I learnt so much from my great mentor, who was Bernard Haitink, whose assistant I was at Glyndebourne, and I also assisted him at Covent Garden a bit. And he is just such an economic conductor who does so little, and yet creates mountains by doing it. And you learn so much from that. And so watching Bernard do a huge Mahler or Bruckner symphony, and just create this magic with doing little. Whereas the other person I learned from so much in my Glyndebourne years was Simon Rattle, who at the time was in his early 20s and was all over the place. I mean, he was just brilliant, but he was just so busy physically. You know, he's calmed down a lot too, but he's still so sort of energetic and completely different from Bernard. And I would sort of sit there watching them both thinking, oh. But then, as I say, you find what works for you. And the great thing is not to imitate at all. And of course, one can't do that. One can't just say, oh, I'll do that because Bernard did it, or do it. No. You have to find your own eloquence of gesture, something that's going to read for the people you're working with, and think about that. And if it's not clear, then why isn't it clear? And make it clearer. But so you of course you can't practice conducting unless you have people, but you can think about it a lot. And then when you get to the performance, then let it all go and just be instinctive. You know, just what you've prepared will emerge with any luck.
Yeah, thank you so much for that advice, which will definitely be very useful for our conductors who are watching. But actually, for people who aren't conductors or aren't so familiar with, the world of opera, would you mind giving us an overview of what the conductor's role is specifically in an opera production? Because it isn't just waving your arms about and, leading the musicians through. So could you tell us a bit about what is included in the role, particularly of an opera conductor?
Yes, well, it's interesting because a lot of opera conductors, I regret to say, turn up towards the end of the rehearsal period and work a bit with the singers and then get with the orchestra, do a Sitzprobe, and then take it through from there. For me, what I just love the whole rehearsal period, from the very early coachings really with the singer as one goes deeply into what the role means. I'm a real prima le parole conductor, poi la musica, you'll get the reference of course. It's always the libretto that is the start for me, and I love taking everything apart. I love doing recits, and just seeing what the characters are and how we're going to make that work. And so you work with singers individually at the beginning, and of course every cast you have for, say, let's say Figaro, which is possibly the opera I've done more than any other from those first performances in Oxford onwards. I can't count those, but I still do it a lot. Of course, one has to. It's different every time, depending on the vocal capability of the singer and indeed the character of the singer. And as you put the chemistry together of the cast, you build the sound, you build the style, you build the storytelling with everybody. And so those first few days of music rehearsal are precious. And in some opera companies, they try to give you half a day of music rehearsal or 2 days of. I want 4 days. I want a week. Particularly with the Mozart opera, even if they'd all done it 100 times before, because one has to sort of find that core of who we are and what we're saying to each other. Then there's the sort of the production, the staging rehearsals, where again a number of conductors sort of leave at that point. I love staging rehearsals. I think in an ideal partnership, there should be no hard line between the director and the conductor. The director should be able to say something about the tempo or the dynamic of the music, and that I could say something to the director about what that line means, and maybe would it be better if they were in that position. And it doesn't always happen like that. But some directors are very territorial and think that one shouldn't be involved. But I've had wonderful relationships with directors with whom one does feel like that, and then there's no more joy than that, actually. And then one goes to the orchestra and does orchestral rehearsals, and then the Sitzprobe, which is actually always one of my favorite rehearsals, when it's just the singers and the orchestra for the first time, as everybody feels that. And then we put it on stage and everything falls apart with the orchestra, and then you put it when you rehearse it, and there you are.
There you are. And I really hope that obviously, once things are a bit better in terms of the pandemic and everything, that those rehearsals can start again, because I, for one, am really missing them.
Tell me about it. Tell me about it. In fact, I've been spending the morning, I'll just tell you this, battling with the American embassy trying to get my visa for my next trip, which I haven't worked for a year, like so many of us. And I'm just desperate. I've got 3 jobs lined up in America starting in March, and one of them is an opera. Actually, it's Britain's Albert Herring. And so I've been having all sorts of conversations in this sort of format with my colleagues in Minneapolis, where it will be. But I just can't wait to get into a rehearsal room and start doing stuff with singers again.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on that note, what would you say your priorities are as a conductor, particularly when working with singers and in the rehearsal room?
You mean priorities to the singer or priorities to the piece?
Sort of both, as in what particular things do you value, or do you have certain things that you want to bring out in the performers, or do you have a rigid process?
Uh, I don't know. I mean, but certainly the conductor is an enabler. I think what one has to do is get the best out of one's singer, but also to get them, working with other people and blending with other people and listening to other people. And ensemble singing, of course, particularly in Mozart, is just so exquisite. And it has to be perfect. It's if it's not perfect, it's rubbish. There is nothing in between. It has to be perfect, and so one has to sort of go on about that a bit. Even if one's at the Metropolitan Opera or in Little Puddle in the Marsh, you just have to insist on those particular technicalities of ensemble and intonation and all that. But as I said earlier, when you really rehearse things properly, then you can trust them to go for it, and then just merely then you guide and and navigate and a little bit put your foot on the accelerator or brake and tell the story. Tell the story.
Yeah, tell the story, I think, is such a key priority for us as a society anyway, if not for so many of the guests that we've had on this talk series. I wanted to sort of turn a bit to your work, particularly with older music and, sort of historically informed performance or using older or period instruments, particularly, for example, in music of the Baroque, of which you are music director. I wanted to ask, what interests you in terms of using older instruments, and who do you think the kind of audiences for that sort of performance in 2021 come new performances when they're allowed again?
I have to specify that music of the Baroque, as I have learnt to call it in Chicago, is actually a modern instrument orchestra. It's a chamber orchestra and indeed chorus, fantastic professional choir. I mean, they're amazing. They're the best choir in North America, actually. Fabulous to work with. But the players are, we are Chicago based. Most of the players come either from the Chicago Symphony or from the Lyric Opera, but they're the best players in Chicago. And they do this music because they love it. 17th and 18th, mainly 18th century based, actually. If I do 17th century music, I absolutely do use period instruments. I hate to do, in fact, I never do Monteverdi or Cavalli on anything other than period instruments, because I think it just sounds wrong. It feels wrong. It sounds wrong, and music sort of turns a corner a little bit with Vivaldi, and and also everybody has become so good at making 18th century or 17th century sounds on modern instruments, and that's what so many symphony orchestras even do that now. The ones that all the big period, like people like John Elliott work with, and Harry Bickett and Harry Chrysler and Nick McGeegan and me, we just going into symphony orchestras and making them play in a particular way, but not totally senza vibrato, as Roger Norrington insists. I think Roger is a brilliant musician, and we've all learned so much from him, but I think he's completely misguided on this non-vib thing. But that's maybe another discussion for another time. Just read what Mozart said about vibrato. It is there as an ornament. It is there as an expressive device. If it's too much, it's hideous. But if it's used well, is nothing more beautiful. And so one should use it. And as an expressive device, not a great sort of fat wobble. What was your question? Sorry, Angelina, I've lost my thread.
Oh no, well, the second part of my question was just asking whether this sort of using older instruments is a priority, particularly for opera companies, in these days, really.
Well, I've certainly never done a Handel opera with period instruments in a big opera house. On the other hand, I have heard Monteverdi and Cavalli in big opera houses played with modern instruments, and I really don't like it. As I said earlier, I would not do that. It just doesn't feel right. And those textures are so precious and pellucid, and whatever you do with the modern instrument, it's always going to be a compromise. And now, there's no need for it not to be, the right instrument. Once you start making compromises, it's a slippery slope.
I completely agree. I mean, obviously our area of specialty isn't particularly 17th century sort of music, but I personally, whenever I've heard, I think 17th century music played on those older instruments, you do just get a real sense of it being right somehow.
Absolutely. And also one has to be careful that one doesn't use the 17th century instruments in the wrong way. I mean, another of my great bugbears is that Monteverdi's Orfeo was written for Mantua, and every musical instrument they had in that fantastic Gonzaga court was brought in to play in that. And when he got to Venice, and the theatres were much smaller, and it was all public opera anyway, nobody was using big orchestras like that. It was just continuo-driven shows with a handful of strings. And that's how one should perform Poppea and Ulisse, and therefore all the Venetian operas from the 17th century. And so many people I really respect put on these later Monteverdi operas and assume that he should have what he had in Mantua. And we have to remember that Venice is not Mantua. And so, and nor do we need it to be. I mean, if he would have written quite differently if he had access to all that stuff. And what he wrote for was what he had, and that's what we should do, and make it work like that. And it does.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned these ideas of, following what Monteverdi wanted, for example. Obviously, a couple of weeks ago, we had Graham Vick on this show. I wanted to ask whether, because you mentioned before, you sometimes have particular opinions about directors' work, and maybe certain singers could do this or that. Do you have a wider opinion about directors who update the stagings of operas, and whether that's kind of in line with the composer's intentions or whether it's a good thing? Just any general opinion, really, I was wondering.
Yes, this is interesting. I mean, when Handel did his operas, he was often telling old stories in basically contemporary dress. Shakespeare was telling old stories in contemporary dress. So in a sense, they were already modernizing, giving modern productions and modern slants on these things. I'm all for updating and as long as we don't make musical compromises, and they visual updatings don't in any way go against the historically informed performance that's going on below, then I'm all for it, because I think you sort of scrape a little bit off. It's like cleaning a painting, you know. You show the color a bit more vividly as it was. But or to use another analogy, you know, with a familiar painting, wherever you shine the light onto it, from whichever angle, you show up something else. You know, if you go around an art gallery and you look at it from one angle and you look at it from the other angle, and you see different things. And I think that's what a good production does. It's not always a happy experience. And I have very occasionally, I think I've been very lucky in my long career that I've only 4 or 5 times had experiences I completely loathed. And then that is really, truly miserable, when you just think that the production is not only not helping the orchestra, the music, it's actually fighting it. And I mean, that's going back to what you asked me earlier about what a conductor does in rehearsal. I think what one is there to do is to represent what the composer wanted. And if that's not going to be able to happen because of what's happening on stage, then you have to pipe up and say so. And it's your job as a conductor to make it work for the composer.
So do you have any advice then for example, for conductors who are maybe struggling with their director or something? Do you have any advice for how to manage that situation in a professional, but obviously wanting to get your point across kind of way?
It very much depends on the person you're working with. I mean, I'm not I don't really confront, you know, I'm not a combative colleague. On the other hand, I will take the director aside and say, can I just say, I don't think this is working, and blah, 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 blah. And I think that I would never do it. At least I hope not. Have I ever said, oh, for God's sake, bring them all downstage and let them sing? Possibly once. But I'll tell you a nice story actually about a great director. I won't tell you who it was, but we were doing La Clemenza di Tito in Chicago actually, and he was staging the final scene. And there's, I don't know if you know La Clemenza di Tito or most of it. There's a wonderful. The final scene begins with this amazing triumphal march, and I mean it I think it puts the Aida triumphal march even into shade. It's just fantastic. And it's just sort of wonderful, upright, uplifting music. And he said, he rehearsed it, and he said he wanted the chorus to come in on their hands and knees with this music. And just sort of making this statement that everybody did. And I thought, I can't play this music like this when this is. So I waited till the break and went and had a cup of coffee with him and said, I just have to say, I think this music is some of the most upright music I know. And it's completely sort of uplifting and upright. And it has to be triumphant and vertical somehow. And he absolutely got the point and restaged it. It was still a little bit shuffly, but at least they were standing up. So there are ways of doing it, you know. And I hope I did, as I say, once explode and say, oh, for God's sake, bring them all downstage and let them sing. But, you know, in a Mozart finale, when everybody's rushing around, you just need to get that ensemble together, and you can't have people at the back of the stage running in and out and not being with anybody else. So you keep an eye on that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think that sounds as if it's a really well managed, you know, creative situation. I mean, you're really known for being a Mozart specialist, and you've definitely confirmed that by mentioning Mozart a lot so far in our conversation. So As myself, a lover of Mozart, obviously my name is kind of indebted to one of the operas. I just wanted to ask a general question, really, which is, what is it about Mozart's opera that makes you return to them so often and so constantly?
Well, for me, they are the sort of summit. Not just because musically they are so brilliant. I mean, such genius pieces. I mean, the finales alone of the Great Da Ponte trilogy. I think those are the three that. Well, I mean, we'll come to Magic Flute in a minute, but the three Da Pontes are sort of right up there. Your opera, Don Giovanni, of course, is one of the most complex and demanding. And my goodness, how hard is that Act One finale with all those bands in different mute? I mean, how modern is that? How contemporary is that? You know, for a man who loved puzzles, and he did, to try and put four orchestras together playing in different times and different moods in different parts of the stage, it's really hard to get that together. But it's not just that the music is so brilliant and the construction is so brilliant and that the individual arias are so wonderful and the stories are so good, and what it tells you about people and human nature and how people treat each other. It's all of that. And as I say, every time one does it, I learn something every time I do it. From the last figure I did actually was with my students at the Royal Academy of Music. I learned so much doing that, you know. Different people bring different things to it, and you think, yes, of course, and this is something, let's go with that. And it's just, as I said earlier, you get closer and deeper in. I mean, the one that absolutely shouldn't work at all is Magic Flute. I mean, it's sort of three operas in one. It's you know, it's part pantomime, part rescue opera, and part well, sort of Masonic allegory. So you begin with a sweet little bird catcher telling us that he's looking for a wife, and you end up with this sort of massive Masonic ceremony and great truths. And meanwhile, we've all lived and died, and the people who we thought were good were bad, and then the people we thought were bad were good, and it's just, it has no business to work, and it does. It just does. And then, of course, Idomeneo is the greatest opera seria I think ever written. Die Entführung, that true rescue opera, absolute statement of the Enlightenment. I'm still upset about a production I saw in Berlin over 10 years ago by the famous Calixto Vieto, who sort of rewrote parts of Die Entführung and you know, made people rape each other and murder each other. And this is an opera, an Enlightenment opera, that's about forgiveness and reconciliation, and it's not about murder and revenge. And I'm still angry about it. So that there's always a lot to learn about in these operas, but not that. Not that.
And I think it's you know, if anything, a testament that the operas are so often performed and interpreted differently, whether it's a successful interpretation or not. I think, to me, that is truly a credit to Mozart's genius that they are performed so often.
Absolutely. And indeed, you've had Peter Sellers in this forum, have you not?
He's upcoming. We haven't had him yet, but
he's well, I mean, he's, you know, his Mozart is extraordinary. It's always new and always different. And I don't always agree with everything, but don't tell him that. Curiously, I've never worked with him, though. I have done one of his productions. I did his Handel Theodora, actually, the Glyndebourne one, which I did in France. And it was he's just an extraordinary man for finding new stuff and new ways of doing things. He's always going to be invigorating and thought-provoking, and I mean, like the great directors are the ones who know the pieces inside out. Peter does, Graham does, for sure. start mistrusting your director when they're working from a translation, even worse from a CD booklet. Um, Preferably enjoy conductors who work from scores, you know, who really understand the music. And you know, I've worked with directors who know every word of every recitative, and and that's how it should be.
Absolutely. So do you think then, for example, language skills are an important part of a conductor's music, really?
Essential. And one learns that the hard way, in a sense. And I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, I have once done an opera in a language I don't speak, and that was when I did Onegin in Russian. And I don't speak Russian. I did that at the Academy, actually. I mean, I adore the music and always have. But a language I don't speak or even read. But I worked so hard on that, and we had wonderful Russian coaches at the Academy working with the students, and this wonderful woman called Ludmila Andrew, who was Russian Canadian, had a great career as a singer. Used to coach. Sadly, she's dead now. She died quite recently, but she used to work a lot at the Royal Opera House, and as a Russian coach, it was just brilliant. And she made a proper transliteration for us, and coached all the singers. And I lined up a couple of sessions for me with her, so that I got coaching too, because you know, of course, one knows what the lines mean because you have a translation and you have a transliteration, but you need to know what every word means, because that's how Tchaikovsky shaped his line according to that particular word. It's not enough just to know that roughly means I'm going to church now. You have to know which is the word for church rather than now, and so on. And so I really, really did work on that. And by the start of the rehearsal period, I was pretty good. And by the performances, I was pretty fluent. But I have to tell you, Selena, that I suppose we did that, 5-6 years ago. The other day, I took the score off the shelf because I was looking up something, and I looked at my score with the Russian text in it, and I thought, I haven't the slightest idea what that means. It's somehow I'd lost it, you know. I think I could get it back, but languages you learn early in life stay with you. Languages you learn later in life are difficult to retain.
Well,
and anybody wanting a career in opera, you need the three basic languages, you know, French, Italian, German, not necessarily in that order, Italian, German, French. And then learn your Russian.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you can get the Russian skills back at some point, and I definitely implore anyone who wants to work in opera to learn exactly those three languages. I'm just conscious of time, so I wanted to turn to a few other questions quickly before we then go to our audience questions. So firstly, in 2020, you were actually awarded the Royal Philharmonic Society Game Changer Award for essentially bringing more women conductors to the stage. Congratulations. I wanted to ask whether you think there are now enough women conductors on the stage, whether there should be more, and I guess if there should be more, how we can go about doing that.
I was thrilled to get that award. It's a lovely one to have. I mean, I think what it basically says that I was one of the first women conductors, and I'm certainly one of the oldest. And my goodness, the landscape has changed a lot since I started. And I think it's changed a lot in the last even 3-4 years. Suddenly, there are fabulous women on the international circuit, getting really great positions, getting great orchestras, getting great opera companies, and getting good positions in them, and doing wonderful work. And it's completely thrilling to see that. There are still not nearly enough, but you know, we're accelerating, and it thrills me more than I can say to see so many young women coming into the profession and doing so well. I would, though, add one big caveat that I would hope that all of us are employed because of what we do with the music, not because of we're women. I don't want us just to be there as a token or a gesture. And I have to say that in my long career, I think there have been many occasions when I've not been appointed to some role or given some job because I've been a woman or not even considered for it. But there have probably been others where I was given it because I was a woman, and that would be interesting just to get the public. And both those are wrong. The only thing that matters is what the music sounds like and whether you have to say anything in it. And to sort of go on that horrible treadmill of let's get another woman to do this because that's what we get, a woman who's good, and there are plenty of them. And I am thrilled, as I say, that it has changed, and keep at it.
Absolutely. And yeah, let me just again offer my sincere congratulations for the award. I think it's a fantastic, plight, and I really hope to see more women conductors in the future. I have one more question before we turn to our audience questions, which is kind of talking about the pandemic and how 2020 really affected things. So I guess I wanted to start by just asking, how well do you think the opera industry has responded to the pandemic?
Some opera companies have done better than others, I have to say. I mean, funny enough, E&O has done amazing things in surprising ways. In the first sort of 2 or 3 months of lockdown, what did they do? Their wardrobe department made PPE. I mean, that was fantastic. And then they've done all sorts of outreach projects as they've got in. They were the ones who put on an opera in Alexandra Palace where you could drive to it in your car. And I mean, I didn't actually go. I didn't really want to hear Bohem sitting in my car. But, I just thought it was great they were having these initiatives. And actually, Grange Park Opera, the great Wasfi Khani, an Oxford graduate, of course, it has been so imaginative in this country. Other companies have not done so well. The Metropolitan Opera, I regret to say, has done appallingly, not even paying its orchestra. Other companies, companies I was actually booked on a plane to Montreal and was then going on to Houston to do a magic flute there last March when everything closed down. And Houston Grand Opera, for instance, have been completely brilliant. Not only did they actually pay us something for not doing it, actually, which was fantastic. It was the only company that did, but obviously not the full fee, but just a bit. But they re-employed everybody. I mean, I'm going back to do that flute, please God, in 22. So it's some were just really level-headed and got themselves together and behaved properly, and others have been more sort of have given into it. And again, I think the smaller companies have done better than the big ones, and I quite see that it's like some of the agencies have gone, and the smaller agencies are the ones that are keeping going. It's a really, really extraordinary time that we're all living through, and I think life will never be the same again.
I think you might be right, but I, for one, am feeling optimistic with the advent of a vaccine, and I'm hoping that...
I've had one.
Oh, you have? Oh, fantastic.
I've had my first one, yeah.
Well, that's really great to hear. And I hope that, to anyone watching right now who's been affected by COVID, I really hope that everyone is well and that we are able to perform again soon.
Absolutely.
So I just wanted to turn to our audience Q&A, just because I'm aware we don't have much time left. Just looking at these questions, one person asks, well, they say, it's incredible how shortly after graduating from Oxford, you managed to have your professional debut. Did you have to work as a repetitor first to get employed, or did you know from the start that you wanted to conduct?
Yes, it was, my route was through that 17th century opera route, so that I'd be putting on these Cavalli and Monteverdi stuff in Oxford. It slightly attracted attention because the whole period instrument thing was just growing up then. This was in the 70s. And I was then asked by the Wexford Festival, that was my debut, if I would do a Cavalli opera for them. And yes, that was an incredible start for me. And then the BBC asked me to do something, and then the English Baroque Festival. And so the first year after finishing my DPhil, I did have some quite nice work, but then of course it all fell apart. I mean, you know, I didn't have anything then for a year or two. It was very, very hard work. I mean, the odd thing, you know, just the odd thing. But the turning point for me actually was going to Glyndebourne. I thought, because I'd never learnt my trade really, I wanted to not be the focus of attention all the time, the conductor, but actually to be a member of a music staff. And I went to Glyndebourne as a junior member of the music staff. And I'm not a very good pianist actually. And so I think they made me chorus master almost immediately, and which I adored. And then I became music director of the touring company, and as well as chorus master. And I had a just fabulous time at Glyndebourne, and that's where I learnt my trade really. So I sort of feel I had a bit like Concord. I took off again into the profession once I went to Glyndebourne.
Thank you for sharing that. Our next question is, what advice would you give to aspiring opera conductors for starting a career in opera? And I might add to this, particularly for women opera conductors who are starting out.
Well, yeah, yes. If you are a pianist, that does help. If you are a good pianist and can be a repetitor and just go in and be part of the room, be part of the process at whatever level with whatever company. To go to one of the conservatories now and do the opera courses there, the postgraduate opera courses are all great. If you're a repetitor with those skills, then that's a great way in. If you haven't got those skills, which I didn't, I mean, I can play recit till the cows come home, and I always play my own recits in 17th and certainly 18th century music, Mozart and everything. But if you haven't got those skills, then you have to find your own way in a little bit more on the side. And you probably want to get yourself attached to somebody as an assistant or as an observer or as a, you know, just be around people who are in the business. I don't know, maybe did Graham Vick have anything to say about that, getting into opera as a young person?
He had some quite helpful advice, but I think mainly was just to sort of be passionate about it and want to do it and have the languages and everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll echo all that.
That's great. So I'm just going to ask one final question, which is, okay, are there any operas which you haven't conducted yet, which you would still like to?
Yes, there are two. And they have eluded me, though I have worked on both of them. One is Peter Grimes, and the other is the Rosenkavalier. And Rosenkavalier surely has to be conducted by a woman. I mean, for heaven's sake, that's what it's. But I just love every bar of that, and I worked in it, you know, in various ways at Glyndebourne. And Peter Grimes, I've known since I was sort of 16, and I assisted Bernard on it at Covent Garden in the 80s. But it's never come my way. I do Britain operas, and I've done this, but that one I've not yet done. So if you know anybody who would like me to conduct Peter Grimes, I'm ready.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sure we'll be seeing your production of Peter Grimes and A Rosenkavalier at some point. Dame Jane Glover, thank you so much for joining us for Opera in Conversation today. It's been a true pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Great pleasure. Thanks for having me. Good luck to everybody and stay well.
Indeed, stay well. So at the beginning of this talk, I promised that I would be introducing some exciting news. I'm really excited to announce the launch of our virtual opera project, which we are doing at the end of this term, which is called Opera for One. It's consisting of several different songs, which are all being written specially. And right now we are looking for a cast. So if you're interested in auditioning, please check out our website, our social media pages, and sign up because we want you to be in this. It's going to be a fantastic project and we'll be releasing it in mid-March, all virtually, and it's being written specially. So please do audition for that and do tune in for our next talk, which will be the same time next week. I'm going to hand over to Priya now, but thank you so much for joining us. I've been Zelina Vuliami and good evening.
Thank you, Zelina. Thank you, Zelina, and thank you so much, Dame Jane Glover. That's been an amazing hour, and I'm sure I speak for our audience as well. And I hope you've been just as inspired as I have. Our next talk is next Tuesday at 6 p.m, same time, with Annelies Miskimon from the English National Opera. So if you're interested, please do watch out. As always, all our previous talks, including this one, if you've joined a little bit late, are available in this playlist, Opera and Conversation, on our YouTube or on our website. We hope you've enjoyed, and wherever in the world you are, thank you so much for tuning in.